Hello and welcome to the podcast. Our first video audio podcast with me, Paddy Delaney. You're very welcome and welcome to Informed Decisions HQ on the absolute golden Mead Gold Coast today, Monday, the 16th of September. We have the Laytown Beach Races, Horse Racing Festival on today here in East Mead. Don't know if I'll make it today myself between work and kids' activities and one thing and another. But you are most welcome to this podcast. And I'm going to talk about what I think is quite an interesting subject and hopefully will be helpful to you, dear listener. Before I do, as I said, welcome to the office here. You can see the beautiful East Mead sunshine behind me if you're watching this video. And the video is available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, Informed Decisions. And we'll have a link in the show notes on the blog, informeddecisions.ie, and on the podcast, which is also available on informeddecisions.ie. At some point, I think we're going to try and stream it to Spotify. We'll see how we go. And thank you to Paddy McKenna of Chemistry Media, who told me that I should be doing video for the podcast to help get it out there. That Google are changing their algorithms or something. So look, we'll try it. Hopefully it'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to trying it and seeing if we get a bit of traction or if a bit of fun. We'll put up some clips and stuff. Speaking of fun, you can probably just see and lovely Informed Decisions table mat, a mouse mat type of thing behind me there. And it struck me, maybe we should do a little Informed Decisions mouse mat quiz. Remember like the Larry Gogan Just a Minute quiz? Or a mug. There was the 2FM mug, Dave Fanning mug. I can't remember exactly what it was, but maybe we should do something a bit of fun. All right. So the first person to email admin@informeddecisions.ie with the date on which the very first Informed Decisions podcast was put live on our website. Can you tell me what date that was? First in is going to get their very own, what I will believe will soon to be coveted, Informed Decisions mouse mat. Get it into you. So let's have the crack with that. Anyway, onwards and upwards. What am I talking about this week? Well, as I mentioned, I am talking about something that I believe is quite interesting, right? And that is guardrails for Irish retirees, and as in how and when to draw down income and how to optimize the income that you're drawing from NARF. Going to go through some specific examples and workings to help outline that for you. Before I do, very, very briefly, I'm going to actually share a slide here, okay? And this is the beauty of what we can do with the video. I love this. Anyone that knows me or anyone that listens to this will have heard me talk about JP Morgan Guide to the Markets before. Really, really interesting pieces of research. There's European, there's Asian, there's US data and charts. Picture paints 1,000 words, right? I want to show this slide, and hopefully if you're watching the video, you can see this particular slide, right? I'll zoom in. Look, we can do all sorts of wonderful stuff here, okay? And this is showing the S&P 500, so the top 500 listed companies in the US. Their price, the price earnings ratio of the S&P 500 over time, and the subsequent 10-year returns, all right, that are achieved. You can see that green line is right there. So it's around 21 times earnings for the S&P 500. So the the price, I beg your pardon, of the S&P versus the earnings, the dividends that it's throwing out at its current point is right here, about 21 times. That ratio, PE ratio, 21 times. And you can see what this is showing as it charts the subsequent 10-year returns annualized. Okay? You could say an average there of around 4% a year based on its current annualized, or so, I beg your pardon, the current PE ratio. Whereas if the PE ratio was down at, say, at 14, you can quite clearly see that cluster probably averages in at around 10, 11% subsequent 10-year returns. So does this say that we're going to get maybe 5% per year if we're lucky for the next 10 years from the S&P 500 because of its current positioning on this price earnings ratio? Perhaps it does. Perhaps there will be an outlier. Who knows? Should you change or do something drastic on the back of it? I would think not. Again, this is just the S&P 500 that we're talking about here. I want to turn to this slide, and again, this is just showing the S&P 500 forward price earnings ratio and subsequent 1-year returns. Okay, subsequent 1-year returns. Again, the PE ratio was sitting at around 21. The variance of subsequent 1-year returns really is everything from minus 22 to plus 45. So where will we get for the next 12 months on the S&P? Nobody knows. Could it be minus 25? Absolutely. Could it be plus 45? Absolutely. Again, we're not going to be betting the house on this. For most of us long-term investors, we'll have an element of S&P 500 within our portfolio, and we will hold and we will remain and we will not react to what we're seeing. Okay, this is an interesting slide from my perspective. Back to me. Where are we at in terms of this week's topic? Okay, and what has this got to do with guardrails? Well, I think it's a very interesting piece. One of the big questions I hear from retirees all the time is, how much can I actually spend in retirement without running out of money? And let's call it next chapter instead of retirement, shall we? Let's give that a go. I believe that it is one of the questions that us as financial advisors really have a duty to help clients with. There are really fundamentally, there's two ways that you can go. And this is, again, assuming you have an approved retirement fund, an ARF, as opposed to an annuity, right? An annuity, of course, is where you hand over your money to an insurance company and they say, hey, annuity rates are 4.5% now, so we'll give you 4.5% of whatever you're giving us. Let's say it's €1 million, we'll give you 45,000 every year for the rest of your life. If you live, they might guarantee it for 5 years. So even if you die within 5 years, we'll pay that income out, but after that it will stop. Or we'll pay you for as long as you live, and if you have a partner or a spouse, then we'll pay them maybe 50% of what we were paying you, so 22,500 a year for as long as they live, and once they die, then we'll stop paying and we'll keep the balance. Or if you live a very, very long time, then potentially you will get back more than you gave them on day one. That's an annuity. We all know that. We're assuming you don't do that because most people nowadays are not doing that for that very reason. The pot dies with you. So if you have an ARF, going back to my point and stop rambling, Paddy, if you have an ARF, you have two options. You take what revenue tells you to take, or you take a more dynamic approach where you and your advisor try and optimize your income and your legacy. Two very different ways. And I'm going to talk about each and the pros and cons and the workings of each. So let's look at take what revenue tells you to take first and foremost. I believe it is Section 790D of the Taxes Consolidation Act 1997. To be honest, 30 years ago at this point. Sets out the rules for a scheme of imputed distributions, annual payments to you from your ARF, your approved retirement fund, and indeed vested PRSAs, which ultimately are the same thing in terms of taxation and workings and imputed distribution and indeed death benefits. So if you have either of these and you have triggered your pension by making a withdrawal and you're over 60 years of age, you'll be getting an imputed distribution each year. At least you'll be paying the taxes if you did, if you don't take it, whether you like it or not. And you can read more on this hot topic in Chapter 28 of the Pensions Manual from Revenue. I'll put a link in the show notes and indeed in the blog on informeddecisions.ie. It's important to note that these set out the minimum you must take. So the imputed distribution, as it's known, is the minimum. It does not say that you can't or shouldn't or wouldn't, couldn't take more, right? So some of the more traditional methods of deriving a retirement income in Ireland rely on that static approach. So that's that 4% of the portfolio each year. That's the minimum imputed distribution once you turn on your pension. So 4% you have to take every year. And that sounds simple. Grand, right? We'll take 4% of €1 million pot and get 40 grand a year. Happy days. Well, it doesn't really work out like that. It's a little bit more complicated than that, especially when markets go up and down. All right? So the imputed distribution rules are, once you have triggered your pension, as in starting to draw it down, or you've taken a tax-free lump sum, once you hit the year in which you turn 61, you must be given by the trustees or your QFM 4% of the pot value in that year. Once you turn 71, you must be given 5% of that pot value in that year. And if you've more than €2 million in the pot, this has nothing to do with the SFT, but if you've more than €2 million in the pot, you must take 6% each year. The rules, that's the imputed distribution rules. I'm going over old ground, dear listener, but bear with me. Interestingly, the percentage of the pot that must be paid out, that 4% or 5%, is calculated on the 30th of November each year, right? So that's the actual date. That's the line in the sand on which that calculation and the amount that must be paid out is done each year. So that gives time to pay any additional that you might need to be given before the end of the year. And it gives time for the trustees to do the tax return on your behalf before the following February. That's their obligations. So let's look at this, taking what revenue tells you to take. We'll take an example of hypothetical Mary, we'll call it, right? She has an ARF of €1 million and she's retired now, and at the advice or lack thereof from her broker, she follows the imputed distribution approach. And this is not to say that imputed distribution is terrible and nobody should do it, right? We're just saying it's quite often, yeah, look, we'll send you 4% of the pot each year, away you go, thanks very much, right? And that's the extent of it. Again, maybe that's right, maybe it's not. But in her first year, the pot is €1 million. Let's say it's 2024. €1 million, 4%, it's going to get 40 grand this year, okay? Give or take. And that's going to cover her living expenses. Mary's delighted with that. That covers things nicely for her. She's in the first year of her new chapter and she's loving it. And she's also paying practically zero tax on it. She's on the pig's back. Happy days. But let's imagine the market has a bad year in 2025 and her portfolio, her ARF, now $1 million, drops by 35%. And let's say the ARF goes down to 650,000, I beg your pardon, right? If she sticks with the 4%, which is what the imputed distribution would do, her income for 2025 would be 26,000, falling from 40,000. It's a significant drop. 14 grand pay cut. The second year in, that's not the kind of thing that Mary would necessarily be excited about, I would imagine, in her second year of her new chapter and trying to enjoy the freedoms that her newfound freedom. I don't think that's what she'd be looking for, but that's what happens. 4% falls in that scenario. If she does nothing, that's what will happen. Okay, she follows the imputed distribution and the story. Now let's fast forward to 2026 and let's say the market's bounced back by 35% from that low point, bringing her portfolio back to 870,000 odd. Following the 4% approach, her income in 26 rises back to 35,000 approximately. It's better than the previous year, still 5 grand off, right? And it's still 10 grand off, 10% off, I beg your pardon, her starting point 2 years ago. And this is before we consider what inflation might have done to that income over those 2 years as well. And this is where imputed distribution can feel a bit rigid and repressive in our view, to be perfectly honest. Mary's income drops dramatically when the market has a bad year, recovers somewhat in the good year, but it's not fully back to where it started. And again, this is just a narrow 2-year extreme window, right? I'm painting that picture just to give you the realities of this. It's not to say that this is going to happen, but it does happen, right? And it just shows that fluctuation, the lack of stability for Mary ultimately, and the concern that that would give rise to. That is my issue. It's following the rules, but it is really creating a lot of stress, anxiety, and potentially doing Mary out of some really good years of living, right? So let's look at the other way, right? So you take the time to actually look at your income strategy. Again, this is not to paint a perfect picture. There is no perfect solution to this. I do believe that all of these things require nuance, require looking at the scenario, the individual's priorities, their longevity, right? The circumstances, inflation, underlying assets, the portfolios, loads and loads of things. This is a very simple look at these two different approaches. So let's look at the dynamic, the guardrail method. Again, I've spoken about this in podcast 183 4 years ago. It was just to give a little flavor and a little bit of an update. So instead of sticking to the 4% of whatever your portfolio is worth each year, this is where you set specific income, but you operate some flexibility within the guardrails. Within guardrails, upper and lower guardrails. All right? Preservation and prosperity guardrails, two different approaches. They're ultimately the levers that you can deploy depending on your priorities. Here's an outline. So those two guardrails, the capital preservation guardrail, first and foremost, it's designed to reduce withdrawals a little to try and preserve the pot for multiple decades in certain circumstances. And those circumstances are ultimately, it's triggered when a current year's withdrawal rate has risen more than, say, 20% above the initial withdrawal rate. Let's say, for example, to 5% of the pot value, because of a fall in the portfolio value. So in this scenario, you're taking a set income, and if that set income increases above the initial rate to a certain degree, you can ratchet that income back a little bit by a certain percentage. Gives a little more leeway than the imputed distribution while protecting long-term sustainability. And then the other way, there's a prosperity guardrail. So this rule is designed to ensure you get to enjoy the good times when markets are solid and not die with too much. It's triggered when a current year's withdrawal rate has fallen more than, say, 20% below the initial withdrawal rate because of a rise in the portfolio value. All right? You get an additional bonus to spend, right, in the subsequent year. If this is triggered, the withdrawal, for argument's sake, the amount of income you're taking could be increased by, again, say 10%. So these figures can be tweaked and adjusted, and those guardrails can be tweaked and adjusted based on the priorities. So that's in theory what it is. So let's look at the practice. So for hypothetical Mary, again, she starts off with an ARF of €1 million in 2024. I had to look at the date there to check what year it was, imagine. But she's withdrawing to 40,000. That initial start point is the same here. It's 40,000. Now and again, that's not to say that it's what it should be. This is following the same example as earlier. 2025 comes along and her portfolio drops by 35% again. Her ARF is down to 650,000. She plans to take 40,000. Again, we want to take that set income in this scenario. But 40,000 of 650 is 6.1% of the portfolio. That's pretty saucy, all right? Her withdrawal rate has risen by more than 30%, right? From 4% initial. Okay, got me? Therefore, the preservation guardrail kicks in. But this time we don't cut Mary's income all the way back down to 26,000 as we saw in the static imputed distribution approach. Instead, Mary would reduce her income by, say, 10% only because of the guardrail strategy that was outlined and set out at the outset. So her income goes 10% down to 36,000. That's still 5.5% of the current pot. It's still well in excess of the imputed distribution, so revenue don't have an issue with it. It's still a reduction, but it's a way smoother one compared to the harsh drop in the static approach. Now let's fast forward to 2026 for hypothetical Mary in this guardrail approach. The markets bounce back by 35% in this hypothetical scenario. Mary's ARF climbs back up to around 870,000. the calculation is now showing that, hey, we're going to take 36,000 this year. 36 divided by 877 is 4.1% of this year's pot. I beg your pardon, of the current pot. It's between the guardrails, so there's no adjustment necessary. However, what we may do in this scenario, and again, this is all part of the outlined strategy, she may take an increase for inflation. So an increase of, say, 5% of her income, if that's what inflation has been, okay, in 2026. Again, I'm talking future past tense here. So her income is set. It's increased from 36,000 to 37,800 for the following year, balancing preservation and prosperity. So instead of the roller coaster income changes from 40,000 to 26,000 to 35,000 in the imputed distribution, static, Mary's withdrawals will be much smoother. Yes, it's 40,000 to 36, it's a reduction, but then it's back up to 37,800. So more income while not burning the daylights out of the ARF. And that's the key thing. You're balancing prosperity and preservation. That is what it is designed to do. It's not perfect. And in real terms, you could see scenarios where your income would have to reduce quite dramatically, not as dramatically as in the imputed distribution, if and when markets decline and stay declined for several years, particularly if inflation is going crazy. So again, it is a balancing act. Ultimately, what it means for Mary is that her journey through the ups and downs of the market is more predictable and less stressful. There is a disconnection, deliberate disconnect between portfolio value, market movements, and the income. It's trying to ultimately replicate an almost annuity kind of format while also preserving the pot. That's the guardrails approach. It's designed to be a lot less nerve-wracking, while really backed up by research and long-term analysis and trends in terms of sustainability, in terms of achieving those goals. The imputed distribution are a line in the sand. They're a regulatory obligation. They're not the only way of doing things, though. And that's important, I think. That's ultimately the point that I would like to make here. Imputed distribution is not the only way of deriving an income for yourself in retirement. Do some research, have some conversations with your advisors, and figure out what's going to be the best approach for you to ensure that you have a sustainable, inflation-proof income for the rest of your days, which I hope are many. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I hope it was helpful. I certainly enjoyed creating the podcast for you. This first inaugural Informed Decisions video podcast. I'm sure I made a hames of elements of it, but that's okay. We'll get better. Thank you very much indeed for listening. You're a legend.